up, we'll get Lachie up to actually give you the briefing on the trials that we've been doing that Brad alluded to. So thanks, Lachie.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. I've got to remember to talk into the microphone and look at the screen down there rather than wander around too much, because I know this is going live. So yeah, look, I know a number of people in the room here. I've had a background in fire over about 4 decades, working, I guess, initially starting with the Forest Department and all the way through to what's currently known as DBCA. And the work I'll be talking about today is looking at the potential for mechanical fuel modification, specifically in the context of pine plantations and what advantages that might confer. To start with a couple of acknowledgements, certainly to West Pine Industries and Brad for initiating this work, and also for making their plantation at Dardanup available for experimental fires. Also to the Danju Rangers, who I think Brad's already mentioned, who contributed to quite a bit of the setup of the plots here, and also to the Shire of Dardanup and various volunteer brigades there who assisted with experimental fire on the day, as did several other industry brigades and crews. So I guess part of the aim of the whole project was to get people involved and to make it as collaborative as possible to try and share that knowledge. So, yeah, really what this work was about was to look at mechanical fuel treatments and what benefits they might have in terms of, by changing the structure and the fuel load and the way the fuels are arranged in a plantation, what benefits that might bring. And that could be in terms of improved success of initial attack, which thereby might reduce your area burnt and your potential losses, improve firefighter safety, and I think this is a particularly important one, and it's often overlooked in discussions around fuel modification and fuel reduction burning, that for people that actually have to get out there and deal with fires in a first attack situation, the less heat and smoke that they're exposed to, obviously the less risk, and the better they're likely to fare. And also potentially what can be done to reduce tree damage and mortality. And that's important because obviously there's a significant economic loss with any plantation fire. And if your rates of tree damage and mortality are even slowed, if they're not reduced altogether, it does give you much greater options for salvaging that crop. You can potentially keep the trees growing and standing for a longer period before you're actually forced into a salvage situation. If you think about mechanical treatments too, there has been work done looking at prescribed burning, underburning in pine plantations in WA. There was a good body of work done back in the early 1980s by a fellow called Neil Burrows. Some of you might have heard of Neil or worked with him. And he was doing that work at a stage where there was still fairly major plantation establishment going on in the Blackwood Valley. And he actually developed some quite effective guidance for underburning in plantations, both in litter bed and in situations where you had slash fuels from pruning or thinning. But I guess that underburning under radiata pine plantations has never really been a big thing, which is quite different, I guess, to the situation with the Pinus pinaster plantations on the coastal plain, where routine burning is part of operations. But with mechanical treatments, obviously you're not limited to a particular set of weather conditions, so that perhaps apart from the hottest driest days in summer, you've got options where you could be doing mechanical treatment. You're avoiding smoke impacts, which certainly can be a problem or cause friction with communities if you're putting smoke from burning into a community or against vineyards or other smoke-sensitive industries. Mechanical treatments are also quite suitable if you've got small and irregular planting areas, whereas with burning, it's generally more feasible and more economic when you're dealing with larger and more regularly shaped plantings. And I guess, one of the big things with mechanical treatments is it has got the potential, I think, to build a greater community acceptance of new plantations. And obviously there's a big push at the moment to increase the area of plantations, both in this state and in a number of other states. Minimising plantation losses is obviously critical. Wendy's touched on this, as has Brad, but pine plantations are critical to future wood supply in this state. The government's committed to an expanded program of at least 30,000 hectares over the next decade. And in the context where there's been a withdrawal of harvesting out of native forests, all of our future structural timber is going to be coming from plantations. It's a similar situation in Victoria, who have ceased harvesting in native forests. There's pressure on for New South Wales and Queensland to also greatly reduce or pull out of their native forest harvesting. So these trends are happening right across Australia, and so it just reinforces the importance of the future plantation estate. With plantation fire losses, they do have multi-decadal impacts on wood supply, on the industries that use that wood, and also, importantly, on the communities that actually depend on that, whether they be directly involved in the industry through harvesting or transport or that, or perhaps more indirectly involved through multiplier effects. And obviously the plantation industry is a big employer throughout the southwest here. And unfortunately, those longer term impacts are not particularly well understood. If you look at a number of the post-fire reviews after the Black Summer fires, New South Wales and Victoria, there's really very little recognition of the significance of the losses of plantation there, compared to the impacts that those fires had on other values. And I think it's important that it's not just a matter of, that plantation's burnt, we'll replant it next year and it'll all be good. It's, these flow-on effects will be around for decades. And also, there are relatively few options for salvaging wood out of pine plantations, that have been burnt in the early stages of the rotation, probably in the first half of what would normally be around a 30-year rotation, because your logs are small, they're often heavily charred. You don't have a lot of larger material that might potentially be available for saw logs. So certainly a loss in the first 10 to 15 years of a plantation, if it's an intense fire, that's almost likely to be a complete write-off, which will be require full replanting with very little potential for salvage, perhaps other than for a low value biomass chip type product. But that loss then mitigates all the way through the rest of the 30-year rotation. So I think this, as Wendy pointed out earlier in the presentation, there are some really strong arguments as to why we need to protect what we've got and what we're going to be establishing into the future. Obviously, with plantations, the fuel structure in the plantation varies throughout the age and the rotation of that plantation, and it also depends heavily on silvicultural treatment. So if we're thinking about a new plantation perhaps being established on a former pasture site or a former blue gum site, we'll go through a stage of relatively low flammability. There might be a bit of grass around which can easily be dealt with spraying, but once you get canopy closure, really you're looking at then how the silviculture in that plantation is managed as to how that impacts the fuel. And there's a good example there. This is a mid-age plantation, 14 to 20 year sort of age bracket. The one on the left you can see has been thin to waste. So you've got thin, full felled trees on the ground. There's been no pruning, so you've got a really nice woolly ladder of suspended needles there to assist with development of a crown fire. So I've given that one a big red cross. I think anyone who's dealt with fire would say, well, we don't want to be heading into that if we're looking at an initial attack situation. Compare that with the one on the right, which is a similar age plantation, perhaps slightly older. Well, actually, it says it's slightly younger on the slide. That's a well-managed plantation. It's been well pruned. So obviously we've got rid of all of the suspended needles and fine branches there, which greatly reduces the potential for crown fire development. It's been thinned on time, so you can see the trees are widely spaced. The crowns are much more widely separated, so the potential for a crown fire in that situation is very much reduced. And obviously, if you were dealing with that, a first attack situation, you've got better visibility, you've got better access. It's a much safer place to think about tackling a fire. And so those sorts of structural things are really important. So to come on to the field studies that were done at the West Pine Plantation at Dardanup, the aim there was to compare fire spread and intensity, what we would term fire behaviour broadly, in a plantation that had been treated with a inter-row fuel treatment involving thinning and the removal of both commercial material and also non-commercial tops material as biomass, and compare that with a fuel that was in I guess, a business as usual situation, just following thinning. The plantation itself was 22 years old when we started the work in 2022. Because we had a fairly dry autumn in 2023, some burning that was planned for then wasn't able to go ahead, so that work was held over. There was a follow-up thing in 2023, and that involved removal of commercial wood. I've got a couple of slides to show this in a minute anyway. The logs are actually processed off the extraction row to keep the extraction rows clear, and the residues were then removed with a forwarder, and they were used for biomass chipping. And perhaps at the end of this, Brad, if there's anything you want to add, feel free to do so. But that's just a slide there showing it, so you can see the extraction row there, which has been kept fairly clear of debris. On the left-hand side, you can see you've got the logs, commercial logs that are stacked ready for extraction, and then you've got the residue which has resulted from the thinning operation there. So that was taken in August 2023. Obviously, the operation wasn't fully complete when that picture was taken. In terms of fuel loadings, and there was several rounds of fuel sampling done just to get an idea of the loadings of fuel. And that's important because it, I guess, gives us something that we can benchmark against studies that have been done elsewhere in pine plantations as to how much fuel are actually there. So you can see with the conventional thinning, the fuels, we've divided those up into the needle bed fuel and into the woody fuels. With the conventional thinning, there was a bit more needle bed on the extraction rows, a little bit less in the inter-rows compared to the treated area. And the conventional thinning, more of the wood was left on the extraction rows than was the case in the fuel treated areas. Probably not a great deal of difference when you look at these numbers between the overall amounts of fuel. It's more a matter of how they are actually arranged following treatment. Coming on to the burning conditions, and I guess it's worth reflecting here on just what an unusual, well, hopefully an unusual summer we had last year. This is a chart showing the soil dryness index. So the red line there is the soil dryness index for spring 2023 going into autumn 2024. The black line on the chart is the 5-year average, and these other lines here are just the curves for individual years. So I guess what that really shows clearly is a very early and rapid rise in dryness in the spring. And if you remember back to spring last year, the rain stopped mid-September, and we basically had no follow-up rain. We had 7 dry months right through until early May 2024. And looking at the long-term records there, that shows up as being the driest 7-month summer period over the last 120 years for which there are records.
7 months over summer
I guess
was the driest
our
in
options for doing any burning last year in the spring were pretty limited. We decided it was far too risky to think about putting fire into a plantation with that sort of drying pattern taking place, particularly with the risk of stumps catching alight and then reigniting over summer. So the burning was held off until the autumn. You can see there's the soil dryness index actually reached 200, which is as high as it goes. Obviously, it would have got drier than that, but that's as far as the scale was allowed. We were able to take the scale. There was a good fall of rain in early May. It was about 55 mils recorded at Bunbury on the 2nd and 3rd of May. There was some follow-up rain between the 10th and the 13th, and you can see these little dips here, there in the SDI curve. And then the 7 days leading into the burn were dry. I've put here the forecast for the day of the burn. So the forecast values are there in black, and the ones in the browny colour are the actual observed values, which are either based on data from a nearby automatic weather station or from measurements that we took in the field with a small mobile weather meter. So in terms of burning conditions, temperature 25, relative humidity minimum in the range of sort of 27 to 30. So we're pretty close on the day to the forecast temperature. Humidities were a little bit higher. Winds were not too far off in terms of direction. They're on north side. And similar in strength, probably a little bit lighter than forecast, and a tendency for those winds to decline in strength during the afternoon. But certainly they're fairly similar to what was forecast for the day. And looking at the Australian Fire Danger Rating System ratings, so Bunbury was rated at moderate 22, Capel similar at 24, and the fire behaviour index for Pine was 55. And that's a fairly high level. I'm not sure how familiar people are with the Australian Fire Danger Rating System. That's only been really operating now for, I think, two seasons. There is a little guidebook there which provides background information about the Australian Fire Danger Rating System and what it means. But I guess what a Pine Fire Behaviour Index of 55 means, that's putting it up into the certainly one of the higher brackets. The expectations would be you would have high levels of threat to life and property, conditions that would limit your suppression operations, elevated risk to firefighter safety, and critical to have rapid initial attack to deal with a fire. And you would be expecting spotting with those sorts of conditions. But our fire behaviour was very mild on the day. I guess if you're uncharitable, you could say it was almost a fizzer. So our rates of spread that we recorded were less than about 0.5 metre per minute. So it's about 30 metres per hour, which is a very, very steady, it's almost prescribed burning conditions. And generally the flames were less than about knee high, 0.5 metre. The fires were lit. So on the day, we actually lit two comparable plots, one which had been treated with the mechanical inter-row treatment and the other which was just a standard harvesting. Really, the difference in fire behaviour between the two was not very different at all. They lit okay, so we lit them with a 40 metre line of fire. That ignited, but fairly soon the fires were starting to slow down. In this case, we actually had to do some supplementary ignition to get the fire to sustain. And I think everyone who turned up on the day was perhaps a little bit disappointed with that. But I guess that probably raises some really important questions. So while we might be disappointed with the result, it's certainly not a nil result. And I think there are a number of things that we can learn from it. So as I said before, the Australian Fire Danger Rating System pine fire behaviour was, expecting that we would have had a rapidly spreading fire with potential for spotting and for a large area burnt. We had nothing like that. So that asked the question, why was that the case? What was different? If you think back to the weather, the conditions were slightly milder than forecast, but not a complete miss. The fuel moisture content, and we actually collected samples of moisture content of the litter on the day, that was a little bit moister than the model expected. So our field samples are around about 10% moisture content, whereas the model was expecting about 8%. That would cause a slightly slower fire, but not on the scale that we saw. Again, the winds were slightly lighter and declining during the afternoon, but not orders of magnitude different. I think one of the contributing factors was that overall the plantation had very light fuels because of the manner in which it had been managed up to that time. So good levels of utilisation and good silviculture. So I guess a good credit to Brad and the West Pine team there. That certainly, I think, did make a difference. And also this plantation had been thinned and pruned and was generally in that sort of lower flammability stage of development. And there is a document that explains the logic behind the Australian Fire Danger Rating System Pine Fire Guide there. It's a fairly technical sort of document, but it's there if you're interested. Those ratings, I guess, recognise the number of different stages of plantation growth and development. And so the condition of your particular plantation can have a large bearing on the expected fire behaviour. So I guess to finish up, we can ask some questions. Well, what did we learn and where should we go from now? So I think clearly there's insufficient evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness and value of the inter-row fuel treatment. We think it looks positive. We think it will work, but obviously we haven't got data to prove that, so we shouldn't go too far out on a limb. I think it does say that the ratings from the current system are very sensitive to the structural stage of plantation that's assumed. And that probably raises an important point about our district fire danger ratings and our district index and how they can best reflect the condition of the plantation estate. So if you're thinking about a mature plantation estate where you might have plantations in all stages from establishment or re-establishment through to mature, you probably want all of those stages represented. But if we're going into a situation perhaps with a major new afforestation program where we might have 20 or 30,000 hectares all in a similar stage of development in a similar geographic area, then that could be significant enough to influence the area ratings and the fire potential. So I think there's some work to be done there involving both the plantation managers and Department of Fire and Emergency Services, who are I guess the custodians of the fire danger rating system in the state. Interestingly, I think that extended dry spell leading into May didn't appear to have had a strong sort of legacy effect. And I said to Brad yesterday that if the fire had really gone off like a bomb, I think we would have quite happily realised and rationalised the fact that, oh, we've had 7 months without rain. We should have expected that, but it didn't. So again, an interesting question there. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but it's something that we need to think about. Perhaps it's got something to do with the relatively small amounts of woody fuel in there, and that most of the fuel in the plantation is sort of litter bed and fine material that rapidly absorbs moisture. Whereas if we're in a native forest situation with lots of logs and woody debris and stumps and old trees, that material holds its dryness in a much more persistent way. And I guess finishing thought, perhaps something we could talk about here would be, are any further experimental fires needed or warranted? And if so, how we might best implement those. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say at this stage. Happy to take any questions or discussion. Of Brad, perhaps if you wanted to talk any more about the details of the fuel treatment process, now would be a good time to do so.
Yeah, I can talk about a couple of things that we did that we'd like to do in future. One of the first things we learnt was the value of the first thinning. That if you can do your first thinning in such a way that the residues are removed from the plantations, then you've set your plantation up for access. And the importance of the access was highlighted to us when we pulled the pin out of boredom on the trial, in that the fire in the experimental areas where we'd done the extraction cleaning, the fire unit was able to drive directly up to what you would charitably call the head fire and apply water direct to the head fire and put it out. Whereas in the area where the treatments hadn't been conducted, it still required a front end loader to make a trafficable surface for the 2-4 to actually get to the fire. Now, it was probably within reach of running a hose, but we had a loader there anyway. But still, if it was 100 metres into the plantation, beyond the range of a hose, then it would have been beyond the capability of people to directly attack that head fire. So certainly the access was good. The other observations that came out of it were the fact that the fire kept getting interrupted in the areas where we'd done the fuel treatments, that it wasn't able to burn as a continuous front. It would trickle through and then reignite. So in some cases, we had to reignite it with the firebug. The other thing that we noticed was what we considered was the ease of conducting backburning operations as well. That if you did want to do some backburning, you'd have numerous goes at it. You didn't have to just go to the far side of the plantation and backburn through the whole plantation. You could go, well, let's see if we can do it with 20 metres. Let's see if we can have another go with 40 metres, 50 metres. You may end up burning the whole plantation out, but you have had a few goes to go at it, and the intensity would probably be lower as well, which could actually result in less damage to your trees anyway. So it opens up options for that. It also opens up options for prescribed burning around the areas that we did the treatments prior to the actual experimental fire. We engaged some qualified contractors who definitely didn't breach the child labour laws to actually do the prescribed burning around it. And that was literally child's play. So that went really well. Flame heights 5-10 centimetres, just drips, and it all went really well. No damage to the trees. So it was a good weekend for the family.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah. I'd also mention too, if you are interested in any of the more detailed aspects of it, there is a report on the Timber Hub website there, which has got information about the fuel conditions and treatment, the weather conditions, and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's available for download from the Timber Hub website.
Yeah, Chris Hines, Dartmouth Tree. Yeah, so I've sort of not a big knowledge on pine plantations, but had my little bit of experience up at Palmer last year, helping with water supply. I'm seeing different soil types, as in versus the sand versus the powdery red soils up there. So I'm seeing there's a difference in the way that the soil holds the moisture. I think that's a big factor in it. You know, obviously the stumps be able to burn in the ground. So these are the things I'm looking at and thinking about. You know, when we talk about being able to do these burns, what's the impact going to be on the soil? You know, if we're going to do it at this time of year, or we're going to do it at the end of the season. I think they're a lot of questions that we need to know, and yeah, be able to pass the pub test.
Good points, yeah.
Any comments?
I would agree. I think, you know, the soil types are very important, both in terms of the way the plantation itself grows, but also in the way that, you know, they're responding to rainfall events, and, you know, how long that moisture effect will persist after rain. So yeah, difference between some of the coastal plantations and the hills plantations could be quite important.
Okay, now we've got a question online. We'll try to alternate them between online and in the room. Rick, you've got your camera open, so I'm assuming you've got a question.
Yes, I have, Wendy, and thanks, Lachie, for that presentation. Just confirming you can hear me.
Yep, fine.
You showed us some examples of best practice and worst practice in terms of pruning and maintaining a pine plantation. Could you give us an idea of, well, I'm interested on a couple of planes in that as a volunteer bush firefighter, I'm interested in the danger of accessibility into those poorly maintained areas. So I'd like to know, out of our total inventory of pine plantations, what percentage do you think would fall into best practice in terms of maintaining lack of fuel? And also on that, what's the limiting factor in stopping managers reducing that fuel load? Is it lack of people, lack of machinery, or lack of money?
To go to the first part of the question, and I'm not sure I'm perhaps the best person to answer that. Maybe Greg or Brad, as you know, plantation managers, might like to have a comment there.
Probably the best start is with infield chipping, because it keeps the residues out of the plantation if you can do it right. At the moment, there'd probably be about 10% of the state's pine plantations would have been first thinned with infield chipping. It's not a current practice at the moment. It could well be. There's still equipment in the state, and I suppose one of the objectives that we would have liked to have seen out of this, if we could have demonstrated a solid, compelling argument, was to influence how that practices in the future. Because we had a bit of a fizzer, you know, the fire behaviour was a little bit different, but it wasn't such that you would go, well, under bushfire conditions, these treatments would save your forest, and those treatments there would doom your forest to die. We weren't able to demonstrate that. So at the moment, you know, the argument, again, quite a reasonable argument could be made that potentially these treatments just add expense to your forest management system and don't necessarily deliver any benefits. So I disagree with that, because I think, you know, anyone who looks at those treatments would see that there's benefits for fire behaviour and the ease of control. But could you scale that up, and at what cost? We don't know the answers to those yet. Certainly, Western Australia is in the best position of any plantation growing region in Australia to be able to implement fuel management. We are particularly blessed with 2, maybe 3 markets for materials. We've got export wood chip markets for the pulp chips, and also, more importantly, for dealing with fuels, we've got biomass markets. We can, you know, the very few other places in Australia can you send a machine in to pick up branches, needles, offcuts, various bits and pieces, throw them down a chipper and sell them. For most other parts of Australia, that's just not even an option. So if we do decide that it's something that we want to do, then certainly there's no barriers. The equipment's here, the markets are here, the expertise on how to manage forestry operations is within the Forest Products Commission. So once we can convince ourselves that this is something to do or not to do, depending, there's no barriers.
Okay, just following on from that, so the limiting factor is not lack of people, it's just that these aren't well adopted practices at this stage, so there's the whole process hasn't taken off then in terms of good quality management of pine plantations, removal of fuels. In other words, obviously the implication was there has to be an economic payoff for cleaning up the pine plantation. If the choice was made tomorrow to clean up all of our pine plantations, what would be the limiting factor? Would it be machinery or people?
Well, it's a good question, and I shouldn't cast any aspersions on the current management. The current management of the plantations is exactly in line with any other forest manager across Australia. So how the FPC are managing the forests is perfectly adequate. It's just, could it be done differently? Whether it is in fact better is still, the jury's still out on that because the trial was inconclusive. But you are correct that there's no real barriers to it. If we decided as an industry or as a community that this was treatments that we wanted to do and that the benefits outweighed the costs, then it's something that certainly in forests that I manage, I would be looking at doing as a self-insurance type measure, and that I would, if cost was an issue, then I would judiciously apply it in areas of higher risk. I would look at along power lines, along major access roads, in proximity to settlements, towns, farms, things like that, things that you don't want your fire spreading into. And I would look to do it in a strategic fashion if I couldn't apply it broad scale.
Okay, thanks for that, gentlemen. Yep.
Yeah, and Rick, perhaps if I could provide a perspective, I'm a small scale private pine grower myself. I've got 3 hectares of radiata on a property west of Manjimup, and obviously my capacity, I'm a member of my local brigade there, but I'm only sort of one person, so my capacity to deal with suppression is quite limited, other than through the brigade. So I've chosen there to concentrate heavily on fairly high pruning and dealing with any of the residues from silviculture, because that gives me the best option probably of protecting my plantation. But I think if you looked across the small scale private estate, you would find everything from examples of exemplary management through to people that had planted trees and forgotten about them, and there'd been no thinning or pruning. So
Sure.
I think there's potential there to raise the awareness and perhaps raise the general standard amongst the private growers as well.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, so Greg from the Forest Products Commission. So just want to follow on from what Brad was saying. I think there's a really good opportunity now with the markets out there that haven't necessarily been there for a while, but they are there now, and it's a matter of linking those markets to the operations, so forth. I guess from the FPC perspective, we're into the second stage of growing our plantations. A lot of them are moving into their second rotation, so there's a good opportunity to set these plantations up with some extra mitigation measures. And historically, pruning has been our best way of mitigating our risk from the externals in and around those high-risk sites, and we still continue to do that, especially in leading into that first 14 or 15 years before the first thinning. So, and that's been very, very effective in actually getting the ladder fuels down, be it only on the edge or in small blocks. So that's certainly been employed, I guess. And we still continue to do that. At the same time, we are looking at mechanical fuel reduction opportunities in those really high-risk sites in and around settlements and along power lines and the known hotspots. Yeah, just a matter of getting the contractors to do that. Funding is always an issue. Where do you spend your money? Because there's well over 40,000 hectares of pines out there, and you can't do every hectare of it. But I think you can certainly target some of those areas. And obviously with the government's expansion, as Lachie outlined, with an extra 30,000 hectares of plantations going in, there's a really good opportunity to set those plantations up. And we're certainly identifying those higher risk areas in and around settlements, on neighbours' fences and so forth. So we're going to actually have an opportunity to put the infrastructure and build the house for foundations up from the originally from the start, rather than have to retrofit prior to them. So the protection in and around those should, they should be fairly advantageous as far as going forward. I guess just going back to what Lachie mentioned about the risk phases in a plantation. So obviously with the first 10 or 15 years of plantations, it's most vulnerable. That's when we really got to protect the estate. That's before any fire gets in there, there's very limited return on your investment if we lose anything in that first 15 or 20 years. I guess just wanted to also mention that in the latter stages, and we run a plantation firefighters course for all the brigades now, just to help bring them up to speed with the actual priorities in and around pine plantations and blue gum plantations, and when the vulnerable stages are and so forth. But I guess the main thing is that all options are on the table. We have done some, and I couldn't endorse more. I think that the first innings utilisation is absolutely the key to setting up your long-term protection of your plantation for the full 30, 35 years. And lining up the markets, the contractors and so forth. That's your best way of insulating, protecting your long-term investment.
And Wendy, I think some of these points we're discussing now might actually lead nicely into things that you were going to say in the closing session.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a whole body of work that we'll be looking at a lot of these questions that we don't have answers to. Billy, we'll get to you in a sec online. We've got a question in the room again.
Mine's fairly basic. When you're talking about removing residues, is that stems and branches and foliage, or is it just stems?
Stems, branches and foliage.
And if so, are there sort of long-term sustainability implications from doing that in terms of nutrient and organic matter removal?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a pat answer to that. My personal view is that 35,000 hectares of radiata pine in New South Wales didn't spontaneously die of a nitrogen deficiency.
Enough. Billy, online, you popped your head. Yep. Take yourself off mute and go for it.
Do you know, I've been hovering over that microphone for about 5 minutes, and by the time I got there, it had gone off. Just quickly, I guess a question to all of the parties involved, West Pine, FIFWA, FPC, and maybe Timber Hub as well. Has there been any will expressed around a strategic collaboration to do a cost-benefit analysis of that first thinning, infill chipping as a standard practice to see what sort of productivity, what sort of that would create, what sort of resource amounts and what sort of value that potentially could have? Because I think that would certainly, talking to Rick's point, encourage practitioners to employ that as best practice if there was some science to back that up in terms of economic value.
23 in, 26 out, Liv.
Mike, I think your microphone's on.
That's a great question. Thanks, Billy. And it is something that we are working on. We're looking at the relative economic cost of, because when you do traditional harvesting, you make pulp logs, which go to Laminex or something like that, and there's a certain harvesting system that you use to produce those logs. The downside is the residues are left in situ, and picking them up after they've been left in a disadvantageous position is quite expensive and generates a lot of contamination. There's ways and means of making it easier to get those residues out, and we've seen some examples of that out of Ireland, where they don't delimb the top of the tree and bring the top of the tree out as basically a Christmas bush, and then that gets chipped later on once it's dried, and that achieves almost the same result as infield chipping. Your dead branches stay there because you can't pick them up. The other option is pulp chipping, and that makes pulp chips, but the debarked material, and you may see them around your district when there's been blue gum harvesting, the waste piles that pile up afterwards. That's the bark and the foliage and the branches. Standard practice in first thinning is to take those materials back into the forest, to, as Danielle highlighted, to put those nutrients back into the forest, on the assumption that you won't have a fire. That it could be that you put them back every second E-row or every third E-row, such that you've still maintained access and breaks to the fire run. If you did it every third E-row, you'd have 2 fire breaks that you could prescribe burn off, which would create sort of like a pedestrian crossing effect through your plantation. That would again interrupt a fire run. Then the third option that we're looking at is whole tree chipping for biomass. It's a cheaper option. You recover all of the materials without having to double handle the waste and take it back into the forest, but you get a lower price for the material. You don't get the same premium price that you get for a chip to make paper. It's a fuel chip, and it's worth less, but your costs are less and your yields are more. So we haven't done the numbers yet to work out, which one's the best way to go, and what the cost would be to a grower of choosing 1 versus 2 versus 3. As far as volumes go, it would be relatively simple to calculate the necessary market size that would be required, and it's something that is sort of on the industry's mind, particularly when we're looking at a rapid expansion of the estate over a short period of time. Those trees are going to come up to first thinning age all at the same time, and are going to need to be thinned all at the same time in order to make sure that they're growing and not subject to drought risk. So that will be a challenge in about 10 years' time as to how to deal with such a large pulse of thinning requirements at once.
Thank you.
Mike, oh, sorry. If I can just get you to pop yourself on mute. If you've got a question, we'll come back to you in a sec. The other body of work that might be of interest around that thinnings work is the Timber Hub actually did a residue adaptive harvesting trial where we looked at different ways of conducting the first thinnings, and Clearfelt, wasn't it? Just trying to remember. Yeah. Looking at over the life of the forest, it's actually far more a better cost benefit analysis to do things a little bit different. So we're sort of building on the knowledge of work, and you'll hear a fair bit more about what we're going to be doing next year around a whole lot of this cost benefit analysis and moving the industry through. So other questions from in the room? Or comments or thoughts generally?
So what's your plan going ahead then? Are you trying to get one off now, or we're going to play it safe and wait at the end of the season? This is going to be the biggest issue I have is passing the pub test with the community.
All right. What Chris is referring to is we're looking at some follow-on work from this trial. What we did observe, and Lachie's talked about it extensively, is that even in the areas where we'd done a conventional harvest, the fuel loads were not that high, and particularly the needle bed was not that continuous because of this, I guess, the sandy soil or the lack of fertility or something, but it wasn't a continuous needle bed. So the intention is to bring some fuel into the plots and actually get the fuel levels up to a level that would be more commensurate with the typical harvesting operation, maybe down in the Blackwood Valley or the Donnybrook Sunklands sort of thing, and actually generate some more intense fire behaviour both in the treatment area and the control area, and try and see if we can pull a difference. I was at a meeting yesterday and asked for some money in order to do that, and the consensus in the room was you haven't given us enough notice to approve the money, and are you really sure that you want to light a fire before Christmas? So to answer your question, Chris, looks like it'll be happening in 2025 now.
West Pine have been very generous about setting their fires, like their forests on fire for us, which has been great. Online, is there anyone who has a question? If you take yourself off mute and on screen.